Thank you, and what a powerful congregation of the SJPs across the DC area, which I promise you is the hardest place to wage this battle, because you're in the heart of the political establishment where the terms of reference begin from a very, very perverted place. So I applaud you for your outstanding work. I will try my best to answer questions. If you have questions about the meaning of life, God, and where kids come from, I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to help you with your questions, but I'll do what I can to talk about this issue in particular. As was mentioned in my bio, I have a strong legal background, and law is one of the ways in which we can discuss this conflict, but know that law is the product of politics and power, and law is imbued with a lot of morality. Of course, which morality at what point in time reflects that intersection of politics and power? It's very relevant to this discussion in particular when we talk about apartheid, because apartheid has meaning in law and it has meaning in morality. And today, how many of you, well, a few of you must have been on Twitter, because I know I saw some of you have to deal with this as I did. But as we were tweeting about this event happening tonight, the response from detractors is that you can't call anything happening in Palestine apartheid, because apartheid is something that's limited to the South African experience. To some extent, that's true. But it's not completely true, because it's a legal concept. Apartheid is a crime against humanity. It was enshrined as such in the 1973 Convention on the Suppression of the Crime Against Apartheid, as a way for the international community to express its refusal and its condemnation of its manifestation, in particular in apartheid South Africa, but it certainly wasn't limited to that historical experience. I would like to discuss this using both lenses, but with the caveat that when we discuss apartheid, we should be very careful not to associate it with South Africa in particular, because it's a universal construct as demonstrated by its legal nature, and that's the way we've used it in this movement. It has other meaning, which is what makes it so provocative, and which is what makes it so powerful. The reason we called it by its name is because it reveals that this is not a conflict between two peoples or two states. This is not a conflict of security, national security for land. This is a people's conflict against ongoing settler colonialism, against a state, okay. I have so much to say, so I don't know about, but against the largest nuclear power in the Middle East, against the U.S.'s most unique ally in the Middle East, certainly not its own ally. It's the reason that, the only reason the U.S. doesn't point to Israeli human rights abuses is the same reason the U.S. points to Syria's crimes against humanity, which are not contested, but not to Saudi Arabia's institutional discrimination against minorities, the Shiite minorities in the Eastern Province, as well as against women. This is not because one is worse than the other. It's because one, or several, reflect what's in the best interest of the U.S. as empire. And so as we discuss this, it's necessary to unpack the morality that we ascribe to the different players in this particular conflict. For that reason, what I'd like to do is to go through this history just a little bit, and I do want to impart upon you a legal analysis, not of the Apartheid Convention of 1973, but rather of Articles 2C and 2D of that convention, which relate most specifically to the Palestinian experience, and particularly about the forced population transfer of Palestinians, otherwise known in our layperson terms as ethnic cleansing. And so let me start by just pointing out this brief history and why this came to be a site of conflict at all. So, in response to systemic anti-Semitism in Europe, Jewish persons, in an effort to respond to this Jewish question, had several options available to them, including a Bundist option, or a socialist movement that sought to integrate Jewish persons into a European fabric without distinction to nationality, but rather based on class. Zionism, which sought to create a Jewish homeland for a Jewish people, was a nationalist response and was an other option. It was the atrocities and the tragedies and the horrors of the Holocaust in Western Europe specifically that catalyzed the Zionist movement and made it the option of choice in response to the Jewish question. But even at this juncture, Palestine was not the promised land. To the contrary, other options included other colonial settings like Mozambique and Uganda. Palestine was chosen specifically because of its relationship to the British Empire at the time, and specifically because of its moral weight and what it would connote for a Jewish population that didn't all ascribe to a Zionist ethos. As Jewish persons and Zionists immigrated to Palestine, this is Mandate Palestine, under the British Mandate, they had a choice. They could coexist with their Palestinian counterparts and integrate into Mandatory Palestine to be one of many. Or they could rid the land of its inhabitants and constitute a majority to establish a Jewish majority. This second option is what they chose because the Zionist movement from the beginning envisioned that the land would be comprised of an 80% Jewish population. There was a demographic equation from the beginning. And as put by historian Betty Morris, quote, Ben-Gurion understood that there could be no Jewish state with a large and hostile Arab minority in its midst. That has to be clear. It's impossible to evade it. Without the uprooting of the Palestinians, a Jewish state would not have arisen there. There's no controversy as to this point, except, of course, for those who just figured out there's something going on and have mistaken that Palestinians have invaded Israel. Assuming you're not part of that population, I'll move on. Based on the choice to not integrate with the existing indigenous population, but rather to rid them from that land to constitute a demographic majority, Zionists demolished 531 Arab villages and expelled, or as a result of war, resulted in expelling 700,000 Palestinian, Arab, Christian, and Muslims to surrounding areas, including the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Moshe Dayan, who's a former Israeli defense minister, recounts, quote, Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not a single place in this country that did not have a former Arab population. And here we're talking about Israel proper in particular, which is the pink shade. In 1967, in what some will describe as a preemptive war, and others will describe as a war for the scarcest natural resources in the Middle East, namely water. Water that was available in the Western Aquifer, continues to be available in the Western Aquifer in the West Bank, at the head of the Yarmouk and the Litani rivers, also in the north of the West Bank and in the Golan Heights. Without getting into the onset of the Six-Day War, as a result of it, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Another 200,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed and expelled from their homes. Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the 1979 Camp David Accords, but the rest remains occupied. And in fact, you may have seen recently, Dick Cheney's oil company has just acquired a contract for drilling for oil in the Golan Heights. I'm going to point out one thing here, because you and I are probably not only familiar with occupation as a discourse, but well past it. But occupation in this city remains quite contentious. And it's contentious specifically because of law. Occupation in international law refers to something that was occupied, land that was occupied, territory that was occupied by a sovereign before. And Israel contests that because the West Bank was under the tutelage of Jordan and the Gaza Strip was under the tutelage of Egypt, that neither was occupied, and therefore what's been ongoing since 1967 is not occupation at all. Hence, how they've justified not abiding by the Fourth Geneva Convention that applies to civilians under occupation, or the treatment of civilians during occupation. If you care about the law, and I know that many won't, the International Court of Justice, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, as well as the Israeli High Court, have all rejected this political posture and declared that these lands are indeed occupied and that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to them as a matter of law. That becomes complicated with the Israeli High Court because of the route of the apartheid wall, and we can talk about that during Q&A. But I want to point that out because when we discuss this issue, we're having a hard time just talking about the West Bank and Gaza. And yet the history is much broader than the West Bank and Gaza. The demographic balance isn't just about the demographic balance of Jews and non-Jews in the occupied territories, but this entire land, previously known as Palestine. So what's going on with the demography today? The 100,000 Palestinians who never fled what today is Israel proper are now a population of approximately 1.2 million Palestinians who constitute 20% of the Israeli population. The Palestinians in the West Bank number 2.5 million, those in Gaza about 1.7 million. The refugees who have a different definition in international law because they became refugees before the establishment of the 1951 Refugee Convention, now constitute 6.6 million Palestinians. Okay? So just taking that into account, Israel has a problem with its demographic balance. But let's say we leave the refugees out, and we just take a look at this land here. That also doesn't bode so well for the Zionist vision of an 80% majority. In October 2012, the balance was 5.9 million Jews and 6.1 million Palestinians, if this is taken as a whole. Worse, by 2025, projections say that the Palestinian population within Israel will outnumber their Jewish Israeli counterparts. Only according to Israel's vision, or the Zionist vision of an 80% majority, does Israel have a problem. There's many ways that Israel doesn't have a problem at all. If Jewish Israelis sought to live with their counterparts without distinction to religion, ethnicity, creed, possibly class, although they have internal issues about that as well. They have internal issues about all these things, actually. But in particular to religion, Israel doesn't have a problem. But it doesn't want that. They've been very explicit that they want to be a Jewish state. So they've outright rejected the notion of being a country for all its people without distinction. For many of you who don't know this, Israel internally bifurcates its Jewish nationality from its Israeli citizenship. So you can be an Israeli citizen, but not be a national of the state. If you're an American citizen, you're an American national. Not here, because Jewish nationality confers more rights than does citizenship. In fact, so much more rights that Jewish nationals who have no relationship to the state at all have more rights than those citizens within the state, because they have access to citizenship, to benefits and housing and education, and otherwise that those Palestinian Israeli citizens do not have. This bifurcation operates on several other levels. Does this look complicated? Yeah, and I'm not going to go through it, but I'm happy to pass it along. Suffice it to say that it will distinguish, this mere bifurcation will distinguish between those in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, within Israel, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, the refugees, Palestinian refugees, as opposed to Jewish nationals. Those Jewish nationals who live in the occupied territories, those who live within Israel, and those who've never even heard of it. So Israel has rejected the notion from the get of existing as equals by decree and law. Out with that option. And here I just want to share with you a significant fact that we'll get back to in a little bit as we talk about refugees. The Israeli citizenship law, better known as the nationality law of 1952, denationalized all Palestinians. Now, denationalization is one of the greatest threats to any people, because in order to have any human rights, you have to have a state to claim those rights. As a stateless person, you have no claims to human rights, or very little. That space is expanding slowly. But to have rights, you have to have a state. And in fact, before the Holocaust, the Third Reich denationalized its Jewish citizens, who therefore had no protection from any state. Syria has similarly denationalized its Kurdish citizens in the early 80s. It's an insidious practice that makes very vulnerable a population that has no access to rights thereafter. Palestinians became Palestinian nationals from a British Mandate law in 1925. This 1952 law reversed that. Okay. Remember that, we're going to get back to it. Okay. Another option that Israel has is that it can just declare, we are an apartheid state. We're a minority that rules over a majority, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and we're okay with it. And in fact, in a March 2012 opinion poll, 77% of Israelis said they're okay with it. But the reason that that is also not an option is precisely because of the morality, the moral implications of that, and Israeli leaders have rejected it. Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, has explained that the failure to create a Palestinian state would force Israel to quote, face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights, and as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished. Currently, the outgoing defense minister, Ehud Barak, has said, if and so long as between the Jordan and the sea, the Jordan River and the sea, there is only one political entity named Israel, it will end up being either non-Jewish or non-democratic. If the Palestinians vote in elections, it's a binational state, and if they don't, it's an apartheid state. So although a majority of Jewish Israelis accept the idea of being an explicit apartheid state, per the South African definition of minority ruling a majority, Israeli leaders have rejected that for obvious reasons. Okay, what else do we have left as an option? How is Israel going to deal with this demographic problem? Its best option, and the most popular option, has been the two-state solution, because it sought to create two states for two people. Creating those states would have made those borders permanent. Of course, Israel hasn't declared its borders. They're constantly expanding. But would have made those borders permanent and would have allowed Israel to justify that it would maintain a majority while the occupied territories would be the home of the Palestinians. Just because this is the best option for Israel's problem doesn't mean it was the best one or even a desirable one for Palestinians. Because the two-state solution does not equate to Palestinian self-determination. The two-state solution did not envision the equality of Palestinian citizens in Israel, did not envision the return of refugees. And in fact, at what Israel describes at its most generous offer in the 1999 Camp David Accords, where Ehud Barak made his most generous offer to Yasser Arafat, there were 5 red lines. No to the division of Jerusalem, it would remain the united capital of Israel. No to the return of refugees. No to negotiations on water. No to negotiations on what the borders would look like, to even the 1967 borders, and no to the dismantlement of settlements. This was the most generous offer. Now, what option does that leave for Israel? Well, actually, you all might know this, but I think this, did you all pull this up? This, can I see it? In the PowerPoint? I just want to show you all something, if beyond, yeah, this is perfect. Thanks, Adam. Give it up for Adam. Beyond this rejection of it as a political idea, let's just take for a moment what Israel has done from the early 90s when they signed the accords. This is the 20th year anniversary for Oslo. Happy anniversary, Oslo. In 1993, there were 200,000 settlers in the West Bank. Okay, let me show you a little bit about what's happened since then. This is Israel's creation and doing, what I like to call its Frankenstein. So here I'm going to show you the outline of the West Bank. This is the green line or the armistice line, okay? Can I expand this? Oh, the screen's tiny. Okay, you can see it. You get the idea. Can you see it? Yeah. This is the green line. This would have been one half of the Palestinian state. Oh, and if you're wondering how is it going to be a Palestinian state, they were going to build a bridge or a tunnel or a spaceship. I'm not quite sure. But this is the West Bank, the green line. Now, these red dots right here, I'm going to zoom out so you can see it. These red dots are outposts. Outposts are basically the creation of really Jewish zealots. Is that the word? They believe so much in what their book says that they believe this is Judea and Samaria and it's their religious duty to go and build outposts on the land. Now, these outposts are not funded by the state, but they are afforded state security, and they do eventually become settlements. The settlements are fully funded by the states as well as by you and me. In our $3 billion a year in tax and direct aid to Israel, here are the settlements. Whereas they number, the settlers, 200,000, In 1993, today they number 600,000. Okay, and notice that if you put now, where did Israel build this wall, which they call the barrier? I think that's offensive to call a concrete militarized wall 3 times the height of the Berlin Wall with snipers at various points of it, a fence, which I would like to build, you know, for bunnies and stuff. But anyway, if you notice where Israel built this wall, it's unreal for how closely its route circumscribes the settlements. 85% of the apartheid wall runs through the West Bank. It works to confiscate 13% of the West Bank. And the Palestinians who are now stuck between the wall and the 1949 armistice line have a new category in international law. There's 50,000 of them, and they're known as internally stuck persons. Refugees are one category when you cross a border. Internally displaced means you're internally displaced, you're just not on your original land. Now they're internally stuck. All right, let's just imagine in a perfect world that we are able to dismantle the wall, that we are able to remove 600,000 settlers, including those who believe it's their religious duty to be there. The two-state solution still remains beyond reach because Israel's most significant water resource, where it derives 80% of its water, the Western Aquifer, 60% of that water source is located in the West Bank, directly under many of these settlements. And in fact, Prime Minister Sharon Begin, former Prime Ministers Sharon, Begin, and Barak have all said that any agreement that they make with the Palestinians will not negotiate the water allocation of this Western Aquifer. Suffice it to say that the two-state solution is dead, and I would say that it's not dead because nobody followed Oslo, it's dead precisely because of Oslo's terms. How do I get this back up? It's in Spanish. I can, have a conversation, talk about food or a movie, but okay, here we go. So, what does that mean for Israel? It means that without creating a state for all people, regardless of nationality and religion, without creating an explicit apartheid model and just calling it by its name, without establishing a state, 2 states for 2 people, it's left with the option of diminishing the Palestinian population and concentrating them onto smaller and smaller swaths of land. It's engaging in the forced population transfer of Palestinians by exclusion, by forced removal, by deportation, and not just in the occupied territory, but also within Israel itself. And this is really important to point out here, that apartheid, and I know it's provocative for some people, but apartheid didn't refer to a system where there was just insidious hate. White people hated black people, that's apartheid. They just didn't think they were human. These racial creations, these are social constructs that respond to the needs of a state. In the same way that slavery engenders race analysis about the inferiority of blacks in order to have that labor for free, which then becomes Jim Crow, which now becomes a much more subtle form of racism that's ongoing. Apartheid in South Africa wasn't because the Dutch didn't like Africans. That was a captured market. That was cheap labor. That was land with resources that they can claim as their own. And in the same way, in Israel, amongst Israel and Palestinians, apartheid is driven by a desire for more and more land with less and less Palestinians. And so how do they do this? Through a number of laws. Everything that Israel does is done by law. Every home demolition is issued by a ministry and upheld by a court. Every forced removal has been appealed and approved by a court. Every rejection of a Palestinian refugee is upheld by the nationality law. Everything that's done is done by law. So I don't belabor these points to really make us stuck in the law, but only to point out that Israel does everything by law, the same way that when the U.S. laid claim to Iraqi natural resources, they didn't just take the oil. They made laws that distributed the oil where they got the biggest distribution. This is plunder. So how does it apply to refugees? It applies very explicitly. The law of return, the Israeli law of return, belongs to Jewish nationals only. And Jewish nationals are those persons whose mother is Jewish and has been converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. Palestinians have thought of mass conversion, but it's not quite that simple. So this is more complicated than this may seem. Jewish nationals have the right to return, which is ironic if they don't even know where it is, but have this right to come and claim citizenship, claim nationality, and land rights, and housing rights, and education rights. And Palestinian refugees do not have that right because they don't have the possibility of becoming Jewish nationals. So at this point, the 6.6 million Palestinian refugees remained exiled by force because of their lack of nationality, notwithstanding UN Resolution 194, which has affirmed the right to return, to compensation, and to rehabilitation. In addition to those refugees who are not allowed to return, Israel doesn't treat its Palestinian citizens, its non-Jewish population, equally at all. Last January, the Israeli High Court affirmed the ban on family reunification. The ban on family reunification held that Israelis who marry somebody from an enemy state cannot afford Israeli citizenship to the love of their life, their partner, if they come from that enemy state. So they don't have the right to adjust status. Now we're going to play a little game. Can you guess what those enemy states are, or those enemy entities? Anybody?
Palestinian.
But the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, that's different. But these states, if you marry someone from that state, you cannot change, they cannot have citizenship then, ever, to live in Israel and to adjust that status. So imagine, for example, if we lived in the Southwest, if a Mexican person living in the Southwest fell in love with somebody from Mexico City on a vacation, and the U.S. declared that anybody from its enemy states, in this case just Mexico, could not adjust their status. One, they could stay in love, but they can't ever come back and live in the Southwest again. So, and in fact, the Israeli High Court has been very explicit about this. One of the justices said, quote, "Human rights are not a prescription for national suicide." And so here, the life of the nation is equated to a demographic balance, as opposed to a principle or a belief in equality. That's the ban on family reunification. There's other laws. I can go on and on and on. But I want to emphasize that this isn't just about the occupied territories. The Bedouin Palestinian populations that now live in the Negev desert, there's 19 tribes. In 1948, they were displaced, and only 11 tribes remained in their original places. Now, there's a plan called the Power Plan to forcibly remove 40,000 of them. Forcibly remove them to make room for Jewish settlements within Israel, as well as a forest to be planted by the Jewish National Fund. Israel, in the early 2000s, tried to forcibly remove this population by spraying toxic chemicals onto their agricultural fields. Jadaliyya, the Arab Center for Israeli Minority Rights, filed an injunction and won. And now the state has resorted to straight demolition. And in one case, has demolished the Palestinian village of Al-Araqib no less than 25 times. And that village has rebuilt their homes 25 times. In response, the JNF is suing them for the cost of demolition. For, I think it's 1.5 million shekels. I mentioned the wall and the confiscation that the wall does. Let me just mention East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And I'll try to make this short, but I can't emphasize enough that these laws distinguish Palestinians based on their lack of Jewish nationality. So that in East Jerusalem, only Palestinians have to prove that Jerusalem is their center of life for 7 consecutive years in order to maintain their Palestinian ID card, or their Jerusalem ID card. It's a distinct status. You can ask me about that later. 7 years. So if they get a job elsewhere, they can lose their ID card and never return to their homes. If they decide to live in Jenin with their wife's family or their brother's family for an extended period of time, they will lose the right to be in Jerusalem. If they study abroad, if they work abroad, if they don't demonstrate that it's their center of life, that Jerusalem ID card will be revoked. And since between 1967 and 2010, Israel has revoked 13,115 of those ID cards. 4,577 of them were revoked in 2008 alone. There's similar policies throughout the West Bank, which have reduced the West Bank, according to the Palestinian Census Bureau Central Bureau of Statistics, that between 1967 and 1994, Israel stripped 140,000 Palestinians of their residency rights in the West Bank. And but for that residency revocation, the Palestinian population would be greater by 14%. Okay, I know that's a lot of numbers and a lot of figures and a lot of revocations and violence, structural violence. But let me point out one more case study for you, and that's the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley constitutes 40% of the West Bank. So mind you, the compromise was 2 states for 2 people. The West Bank and Gaza was 22% of historic Palestine. Of the 22%, the West Bank is a fraction of that. The apartheid wall takes 13% of the land. Area C, which is under full Israeli military and civil jurisdiction, takes up 62% of the land, and that includes the Jordan Valley, which is 40% of the land. In 1967, 400,000 Palestinians lived in the Jordan Valley. As a result of Israeli settlement policy, where they have settled the land and taken water resources to build a palm date industry worth $1 million, but to the detriment of the Palestinian farmers who do not have access to that water. The 400,000 number has been diminished to 56,000 today. In contrast, 9,400 settlers receive more water than those 56,000 remaining Palestinians. And they've done this all by law, in an effort to displace and remove and reduce the population. And so, what remains of the West Bank in particular looks like this. And if it's called a one-state solution without addressing these core issues of Jewish nationality and domination, these will be called Palestinian reservations. If, however, we establish a two-state solution, we might call them Bantustans. Neither is an adequate response because the core of the issue is the domination and a racial paradigm that subverts Palestinians to another group of people. How do we address this? And there's a lot of answers to that questions amongst Palestinians themselves, but for a solidarity community, for international solidarity, the answer to addressing this is getting to the human rights of Palestinians as equals, to demand the right of return, to demand that they're equal to their Jewish Israeli counterparts within Israel, to demand the end of all military occupation. And those are the three tenets. They're all based in international law and human rights norms, and they're the three tenets of the 2005 boycott, divestment, and sanctions call. And that's what solidarity communities can do. How Palestinians now need to deal with this, because of the internecine fighting between Fatah and Hamas. Now, as Obama is planning his visit to the region, John Kerry is negotiating shipments of guns and weapons to Fatah in particular. The siege of Gaza, the ability for the PLO to reconstitute itself so that it includes refugees as part of the Palestinian national fabric. All of those are the responsibility of Palestinians themselves. The most solidarity can do in that regard is stay out and demand that the U.S. not make the situation worse. And the greatest thing that you can do here at GW, at AU, at GMU, and where else are y'all from? Did I miss a school?
There's only one at Howard University soon.
And at Howard University? Is to demand that your university board of trustees divest its investments from those entities that invest in Israeli apartheid. And so with that, I'll open up to questions after Sherry and Shelly. Thank you.
See, march on it. Sit and occupy something. Occasionally to speak, but I arrived a few hours early today, and I went to the Holocaust Museum for the first time. And I don't really want to talk about that much other than to just say this. I think that among the crimes of the most blinkered defenders of apartheid Israel, I would now add an utter embowelment of the meaning of the Holocaust in their justifications for the state of Israel. Because to me, as someone raised a Jew, as someone raised a Zionist, to be honest, whose experience in Israel-Palestine exactly 30 years ago this year turned me into an anti-Zionist, a Marxist. A lot happened. The summer of '83. I think that if there are to be lessons from this, among them that are most pertinent to me, is that that even the most advanced industrial and cultural societies are capable of the most barbaric practices, number one, and number two, absolutely never again. And then you look at Israel, an advanced, industrial, cultured nation, carrying out a systematic, institutionalized policy of ethnic cleansing. And we can talk about the perversity of the victims of genocide than carrying out a new one. And of course, the features of them are completely different. That is not the point here. And I open with that because I think that it is, it's one of the things that struck me about my afternoon's visit. To me, as someone who is a Marxist and who is an activist and a fighter, not just a writer and a speaker, it's the resistance that to me is so compelling. You don't spend 30 years of your life as a Marxist in this country without being a hope monger. It doesn't happen. And to me, resistance is so central to the human experience, and it's often underplayed. And the resistance of that museum is well documented and well, as well it should be. But there is something about the Palestinians that, to me, stands out. Because I am not aware, historically, of a parallel of people resisting in that way for 65 years. The ferocity of the resistance of the Palestinian people fighting occupation, dispossession, racism, and periodic massacres really stands to me as a sort of testament of the capacity of human beings to do that, to fight back under the most inhumane conditions. But an intrepid will to resist, which clearly the Palestinians had, and the physical capacity to endure unimaginable suffering. One of the things we have learned over the last 65 years is that is not sufficient to end the occupation and the dispossession by empires. What is needed is the boycott, divestment, and sanction strategy, which for many, I believe, will be seen, and I could be wrong, and I am not the only one who said this. Noura Erakat, who I spoke with recently in Texas, which has just launched last week in their BDS movement at University of Texas, referred to it, and I think very justly so, the BDS movement may well be the third intifada that we have been looking for. I cut my teeth in the 80s as a student at Northwestern University as an anti-apartheid activist against apartheid South Africa. And there are crucial differences between the apartheid of Israel and the apartheid of South Africa. Most centrally, that the Afrikaners, the Dutch, arrived in southern Africa not to displace black Africans, but to hyper-exploit them. That is not the goal of the Zionists. The goal of the Zionists is to completely remove the Palestinians from their indigenous territory and utterly replace their labor. And as anybody in this country who is unemployed understands all too well, that if there is anything worse than being exploited under capitalism, it is not being exploited under capitalism. And Palestinians have even been dispossessed of their ability to work. And they have been turned into an international charity case. And so they can continue to resist. But to replicate what the South African brothers and sisters did. Because primarily, I understand what gets talked about in the West in terms of the anti-apartheid movement is what we did on college campuses. We were not the central feature. I'm glad for those years, and I'm glad to have played a role, and I'm proud of that role. But we were not the central players in bringing down apartheid South Africa. The black miners of South Africa were the central actors in their own liberation. Because under a system of exploitation, they were able to shut down the profit at the spigot, at the point of production. That is not a social power that the Palestinians currently have, not within Palestine. And it creates a certain extra added importance, not only to our solidarity activism here in the United States, where we owe a debt of solidarity to the Palestinian people because of our own government, our own empire's complicity with Israel and the United Nations in imposing this horror on the Palestinians. But we also have to understand the role of the regional players which is why the Arab Spring, which is why the ongoing revolutions throughout that region are so of such great importance to the liberation, ultimately, of the Palestinian people. And though I don't have time to talk about in this presentation about the importance of the ongoing revolutions, because we in this room have to have an understanding. Revolutions do not begin when Anderson Cooper arrives at the square, and they don't end when he goes back to the CNN studios. And revolutions are ongoing. They are processes, not events. Okay? It was not an 18-day revolution. It goes on. Just speak to the workers of Mahala, the factory, the largest single factory in the entire region of 25,000, which has been fighting ongoing. And the many, many millions of workers of the 82 million population in Egypt that continue to fight that revolution, and on and on and on throughout the region. So the solidarity efforts and the struggles throughout the region are so essentially important to the ultimate potential for the liberation of the Palestinian people. I want to talk about two things in this. One is to reestablish the fact that understanding Israel as an apartheid state is not some sort of slur, is not some sort of epithet. It is something that within Israel is highly discussed, is understood, and is simply a dispute here in the empire where this carnage and where this dispossession is financed. Here it becomes controversial. There it is openly discussed and acknowledged as a feature and a fact of life. And then I think we have to have some accounting for why the hell this absurdity continues well into the 21st century. Why? Why? Why the racial hatred? And why the repression on the order that seems so otherworldly and of another era to many of us? So first on the aspects of it that I think get too little coverage here, because it is not, I do not ask you to take my word for it that Israel is an apartheid state. I think it's actually quite important that we listen to the words of Israeli Jewish leaders themselves in talking about what their country is. Because too often in this country, it's made into a controversy when people hold Israeli Apartheid Week events, or as what recently happened in my neck of the woods, I live in Brooklyn, where Omar Barghouti, one of the founding members of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, along with Judith Butler, the queer theorist and philosopher, came to speak. All mayhem broke out in the mainstream media in the United States, in the city of New York, of course, with the New York Times, the Post, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, every politician, decided they were going to make some aspect of their career by trying to attack it. Because somehow this was verboten. This was not to be allowed. This is forbidden for us to actually have a conversation about Israeli apartheid. And yet you listen to the politicians in Israel, they talk about it quite openly. In fact, in 2005, a fellow by the name of Roman Bronfman, a member of Israel's Yahad party, attacked what he called, in his words, an apartheid regime, in this case he's referring to in the occupied territories, adding, the policy of apartheid has also infiltrated sovereign Israel and discriminates daily against Israeli Arabs and other minorities. The struggle against such a, in his words, fascist viewpoint is the job of every humanist. This is an Israeli politician speaking on the floor of the Knesset. This is like an American congressman speaking before Congress. The former Knesset speaker, Reuven Rivlin, openly discusses, in his words, quote-unquote, the racism and arrogance from Israeli Jews and the inequality in the allocation of state funds. And Noura can tell you much better than I all the details of the misallocation and the disparities, whether you look at the water and electricity or you look at the levels of education. And by the way, in a country in which 20% of the population within Israel, improper, nothing proper about Israel, 20% of the population are Arabs. There's not one Arabic-speaking university. You have segregated schools, de facto, if not law. And, of course, the amount of financial, it's literally the difference between $1,100 a year for a Jewish student and $60 a year for a Palestinian if you're talking about inside of the occupied territory, the illegally occupied territory of the West Bank. If you talk to Jewish South African leaders who know a thing or two about apartheid, the most prominent of whom is Ronnie Kasrils, they've issued something known as the Not in Our Name Declaration of Conscience that reads, and I quote, "It becomes difficult
particularly from a South African perspective, not to draw parallels with the oppression experienced by Palestinians under the hand of Israel and the oppression experienced in South Africa under apartheid rule. And they go on and on and on about the daily dehumanization practices that are woven right through every aspect of Israeli society. And you talk to civil rights icons like Angela Davis, or Pulitzer Prize-winning author Alice Walker, who I feel very privileged to have worked with along with Noura at the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. They have committed themselves wholeheartedly to this struggle, wholeheartedly. They talk about their own visits to Palestine, and these are two black American women who are near 70 years old. And so they grew up in the Jim Crow South, and they describe their shock and their horror at traveling through the West Bank and traveling through the checkpoints as something unlike anything they experienced in their youth in the American South. And when you talk about somebody like Angela Davis, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party and the American Communist Party, activist in the 1960s and 70s, who is today a scholar and a brilliant speaker and a magnificent human being, you talk about her experience. You were talking about a woman who, as a child, as a young teenager, I should say, was friends with and knew the young girls who were murdered by white supremacists in the Birmingham church bombing. So when they describe and compare their youth in the American Jim Crow South with what they have witnessed of late in Palestine, they say, we have never seen anything like this. This is unlike anything we have witnessed in our own lives, living in a country built on slavery, well into the late 20th century, when Jim Crow apartheid was still the law of the places that they lived. So this is a fact. This is not something that is a slur or an epithet of the left or of Palestinians trying to sort of finagle with the facts. This is a fact that is openly recognized within the state of Israel, and as Noura cited before, are facts that are even defended openly by many, many citizens of Israel. I want to move on to talk about something that rarely gets discussed, and that is why. Why does Israel need apartheid? What accounts for such vicious levels of hatred toward Palestinians? Because it's not sufficient. I mean, it may be true that you have just absolutely vicious, repellent levels of racism, but why? What drives this as a policy of institutions right throughout the entire nation? And for me, at least, as someone who grew up a Zionist, who then went to Israel-Palestine, was horrified and, frankly, to be very honest, utterly confused by what I saw as a teenager, and then came back and had the great fortune to run into people who introduced me essentially to three people I otherwise might not have encountered, or certainly not at that time. The first one was Edward Said and his writings, the great Palestinian scholar, historian, who, in my opinion, died far too young in his early 60s as a Columbia professor just a few years ago in the late 90s. I was introduced to this book, The Question of Palestine. And the other two figures they introduced me to were Noam Chomsky and Karl Marx. So effectively, two Jews and a Palestinian changed my life. What else is new? But the thing that struck me most about Edward Said's work, The Question of Palestine, which came out in 1979, a few years before I came into my own political awareness, was a particular chapter which I think no solidarity activist can possibly have any legitimacy whatsoever unless and until you begin to view the world from the vantage point of the people who are oppressed. That is what it means to be in solidarity. That's what it means, in my opinion, to be for the self-determination of the oppressed. You begin to try, as best as anyone can, to view the world through the vantage point of the people who are on the bottom. And this chapter, which I read over and over again as an 18-year-old freshman in college, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, had a very profound impact on me then, and it has a profound impact on me to this day. And this is how he talks about the sort of origins, if you will, of this kind of virulent racism, dispossession, occupation, and the sort of attitude that pervades every aspect of Israeli society. And he starts by saying this. He says, "For although it coincided with an era of the most virulent Western anti-Semitism, Zionism also coincided with the period of unparalleled European territorial acquisition in Africa and Asia. And it was as part of this general movement of acquisition and occupation that Zionism was launched, and he goes on to talk about that. And he says, and it is important to remember that in joining the general Western enthusiasm for overseas territorial acquisition, Zionism never spoke of itself unambiguously as a Jewish liberation movement, but rather as a Jewish movement for colonial settlement in the Orient. Over and over again, they actually had a Department of Colonization. And that was what, there's no hiding this in the early 20th century. It's only in later years, as political correctness and identity politics and a level of social and political and racial awareness came out of the social movements of the 1960s and early 70s, that the language began to drastically shift. But in the early years of its evolution, the major departments used to call itself what it was, the colonialism department. That's what they were. That's how they understood themselves. He goes on to say this. He says, I find this very profound to this day. Imperialism was the theory, colonialism the practice, of changing the, and here he is being facetious, the uselessly unoccupied territories of the world into useful new versions of the European metropolitan society. Everything in those territories that suggested waste, disorder, uncounted resources was to be converted into productivity, order, taxable, potentially developed wealth. You get rid of the most offending human and animal blight, whether because it simply sprawls untidily all over the place or because it roams around unproductively and uncounted, and you confine the rest to reservations, right? Bantustans, compounds, native homelands, where you can count, tax, use them profitably, and you build a new society on the vacated space. He's basically talking about how Israel should not be seen apart from the colonial settler project that was taking place in the late 19th century when Zionism comes about, but completely as a part of. That this sort of image that we've been sold and that is pounded into us in every news media broadcast, whether it's friggin' NPR, MSNBC, or God forbid, Fox News, is this notion of the primordial hatred between Arabs and Jews, or some sort of Islam meets Judaism in some sort of, ultimate meltdown. Bullshit. This is utter ahistorical, non-political assessment of what has happened. This has no bearing in reality. It fits a certain narrative, it sounds very interesting, it's utterly facile, and it's utterly false. This is about identifying Zionism and identifying the project of occupation, of dispossession, and of virulent racism with something that we are all too familiar with, imperialism and colonialism. Because that's what imperialists do, and that's how colonialists justify what it is they were doing. And I think that for many of us here, or for me at least, who are familiar, with a lot of I'm too young to have grown up in these movements, but influenced by the civil rights movement. We think about Martin Luther King and his concept that he discussed before the Southern Christian Leadership Conference back in the late 1960s, in fact, back in 1967. And he talked about the thingification of a people. And it's something we understand in this country all too well as regards the sort of the racism, the ethnic divisions that are woven right through American society, the utter racism that lies at the bedrock of everything in America. And he said this, he said, a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them things. Therefore, they will exploit them, and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have foreign investments in everything else, and will have to use its military to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. It's absolutely true. It lies beneath the thingification. You cannot act of Palestinians that takes place in Israel. How else do you understand the sort of denial of those basic national rights? The fact that I, a Jew born in Brooklyn, the child of 2 Jews born in Brooklyn, who are themselves, curiously enough, children of Jews born in Brooklyn. So of a wandering people, I come from the most sedentary band. Our generations of Jews, all born in Brooklyn as far back as Brooklyn has existed, so far as I can tell, could tomorrow
go to Tel Aviv, arrive at the airport and say, I'd like to be an Israeli citizen, an Israeli national, or a Jewish national of Israel with all the various rights, and they would be granted to us. Perhaps not me personally, but they were taken. But you get the fact that I would have rights with no claim whatsoever, and Noura's family has none. This tells you everything about the sickness at the heart of that society, and the society that needs to drive through this. You know, and it's interesting to me, the sort of pathological racism conditioned by life as colonial settlers. You know, is an aspect that a woman who actually, curiously enough, fought in the 1948 war as a defender of the Zionist state, a woman by the name of Tikva Honig Parnas. She's an unusual character. She's one of the last surviving machine gunners of 1948, who then flipped and became an anti-Zionist and an active member of a group that came to be known as Matzpen, the Israeli socialist organization that organized both Arabs and Jews for socialism. And she describes the dynamic, and she's still alive. She lives there today. She's in her late 80s, and she writes. She's not as prolific as she once was, but you know, who is in their late 80s? But God bless her for continuing the struggle to the degree that she is. And she says, Zionist colonialism inhabits the space between two extinct models, she writes, those provided by South Africa and by French practice in Algeria. She says, it is not a blend of the two, but rather a distillation of the worst of each. Wow. Actually very accurate. And you actually look at the ratcheting up over the last decade of this sort of absurdity, like the Nakba law, which makes it illegal for any state-financed institution, read into that, a school or a university, a publicly financed institution, to teach about the Nakba, to teach about the catastrophe, to teach about the dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians as the birthmark of Israel. Can you imagine if there was such a law in this country? That it were illegal to teach about slavery, which is the birthmark, and for that matter, the genocide, the sociocide of the Native American people. Now, by and large, they don't teach about slavery in this country, and they don't teach about the genocide of the Native Americans. It's not illegal. They simply don't do it because they're racist. But that's a separate question. That's a whole other conversation that we can have here tonight. And I like the way Tikva goes on to put it when she explains the sort of ongoing sort of ratcheting up of this. She says, Israel is not a country with an army, but rather an army with a state. Which is really the way it operates. It really is the way it operates. She says, you know, while other settler colonial states ended the colonization process once they'd taken over territory and subdued the indigenous population, the indigenous population in Israel-Palestine has never been subdued. And the colonization practice continues, which is why you see the virulent racism ratcheted up. The colonization process has never ended. They have not finally won because of all the things that Noura was talking about, the demographic threat. I mean, think about it. Babies are a threat. You know a society is sick when a baby is a threat. And that is the way that Israel operates. You know, I think that it's important to understand certain things. You know, one of the things that I drew, and that I learned tremendously, and shocked me, actually, when I first read it, was the racist quotes from some of the early Zionists in the way they described what it was they were doing. The sort of essentialist notions they had about the races and about Palestinians and about brown people and certainly black people overall, all sorts of ideas that is utter crap. But what's interesting to me, for example, he reads about, he writes about how, you know, the war in 1967, the leading rabbis of the day basically blessed the mass killings of Palestinians before the troops would go out and do their duty. Well, lest you think this is something of the past, during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, when what happened was really a massacre. Wars are when there's more or less two forces that face off against each other. But it's not a war when you pen people inside of barbed wire, a 25-foot-high, you know, apartheid wall with virtually a moat around it, control every aspect of life, including water, electricity, where their food gets in, medicine, and all the rest of that. Oh, and control the water border, as they do with Gaza, and then bring in gunships and shoot people. That's just shooting fish in a barrel. That's a massacre.
which is why they were so easily able to murder 1,400 Palestinians in a conflict in which 13 Jewish Israelis were killed. And it's worth noting, I might add, that 9 of them were soldiers. So 4 civilians were killed on the Israeli-Jewish side, and 1,400 Palestinians on the other side. Not a war, a massacre. And it's interesting to me when you see that the quotes of the earlier era of rabbis blessing, you know, these sorts of massacres are not things of the past. That you go and you look. Where is this thing? How come oh, there we go. I can't find any more quotes. I've done something with them. But you see the same sorts of outrages being said today. Here is, where the hell is it? What the hell have I done? Here we go. Oh, sorry, blindness. This is a rabbi. This is a rabbi during the course of the war in 2009. And he says to the troops, there is absolutely no moral prohibition against the indiscriminate killing of civilians during a potential massive military offensive on Gaza aimed at stopping the rocket launchings, which of course was the pretext. His rabbi's son went on to say, if they don't stop after we kill 100, then we must kill 1,000. Then we must kill 10,000. And if they still don't stop, we must kill 10,000, even 1 million. Whatever it takes to make them stop. Now this man who said this, a rabbi, a fellow by the name of Shmuel Eliyahu, who called for the killing of 1 million Palestinians, if need be. He went on to lead he is today the head of Israel's equivalent of the Red Cross, the Magen David. This is a sick society. This is an ill society. But it's a society that is not made up of sort of parallel people from a parallel universe. This is the fruits of colonialism. This is the fruits of imperialism. There is a reason why the United States not only continues, but I would argue in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, has ratcheted up its support for the Israeli state. Because as past politicians of the U.S. empire said, Israel operates as more or less an aircraft carrier for U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. $3 billion in direct aid, and God knows how many $1 billion more each year in loan guarantees and all the other monies that get moved around inside of Israel for their military operations, their settlements, and what have you, is a small price to pay, and far smaller than it would cost to have the 82nd Airborne and other forces parked there permanently. It is far less expensive for the American empire to police what it perceives as its oil, curiously existing under Arab feet, via the Israeli state, than to have to do it through other means, as we've seen over this last decade, as we are now about to commemorate a decade of war in Afghanistan and now, in Iraq, and 12 years now in Afghanistan. This is what lies behind it. We have to understand this as part of a larger political and imperial project of which the United States is directing the game. Israel is playing its role. Doesn't mean that the U.S. calls up Israel and tells it what to do every day. It doesn't really have to operate like that. They have a convergence of interests, right? Of which AIPAC certainly plays its own role, the sort of, the political affairs committee that just met here in the last week here in Washington, D.C. I'm sure people who are planted here are rather familiar with its operations. But it's not because a bunch of wealthy, connected people, many of whom are Jews, are supporting the state of Israel. There's a convergence of interests. It is in the interest of the United States to continue these policies. I don't believe anybody, any president of the United States in the history of the existence of Israel-Palestine, or the existence of Israel since 1948, has ever spent late nights up, pacing the halls of the White House, worrying about the plight of the Palestinians. What they worry about is safeguarding their interests in the Middle East and quelling things just enough so that they won't explode in Israel-Palestine, so that their interests can get met. That's what they care about. That's what the last 12 years in Afghanistan and the last 10 years in Iraq has been about. And that is what the continued American policy has been, which looks the other way or openly condones what are understood to be internationally illegal settlements and apartheid walls that are built throughout Israel-Palestine. The United States is interested in securing its interests. Israel is a means to that end, and the Palestinians are simply in the way. And that is the way the people in positions of power and money look at it. It's revolting to people like us. It is repellent, but that is the way it is. And understanding these features, and I want to end on this, is incredibly important for us. Because you cannot wage a successful battle of boycott, divestment, and sanctions if you don't get the political coloration of why they do what they do. It becomes so much more difficult. I don't ask you to sort of go out of your way to do something because it's morally the right thing, although I believe it is the right thing, but because we actually have a role in this. Our hands are not clean in this. You can't actually pretend that you're neutral. First of all, you're in this room, so now you know. So you can't pretend that you don't know because you sat here. And if you hadn't walked out, well, it's too damn late, so now you know. But the fact is that our government, our tax dollars, help create the structures that continue this oppression, this dispossession, and this occupation. And because we live inside of the empire, we have special responsibilities. We have special rights for the moment, many of us, but we also have special responsibilities. And part of that is building an effective solidarity movement to end this nightmare once and for all. We are horrified. Nobody walks into a room like this wanting to come to Israeli Apartheid Week unless you're one of the operatives of the Zionists, in which case, have your peace and say what you think. And ask your questions or argue or dispute. Go ahead. I challenge you. Go ahead. Go ahead, please. But if you are here because you actually are a humanist and you care about what happens to Palestinians in the world as well as the Jews who are living there, then you have to begin to question, what is the role of my government in perpetuating this nightmare and this crime, and what is my responsibility, and what can I do as a citizen of this empire to undo it? Our hands are not clean, and to be neutral is not to be doing nothing. It's effectively, your silence winds up siding, however you like to read it, with the goals of the empire. That's how they read it. They read silence as complicity. Don't be complicit in the occupation. Oppose it. Join the BDS movement.
Yeah, my question was for both of you, but especially you, Ms. Wolf. Thank you so much for talking. It was a pleasure to hear you speak. My name is Jack Simano. I'm a student at Howard University. We don't have a solidarity with Palestine movement at Howard or organization at Howard. Yeah, and that is my question. Over the past years, as I've become more aware of this conflict, I've spoken to people who are locked firmly within the mindset that solidarity with Israel is the most important thing, that Israel is a legitimate state. And I've tried to give them facts and figures to break them out of this, and every time it seems I fail. So I'm curious if, in the effort of attempting to start a movement at Howard University, is there something that either of you have an idea that you have seen to be particularly effective in opening people's eyes to the situation in Palestine? Thank you.
Sure, no. I mean, it really depends on which audience you're talking about. Have you gone to other student groups that have already have a political vision? Because there you can build alliances based on that shared vision. Palestinians are not unique for what they experience. This idea that they're the most victimized, or we should feel the most bad or the most guilty towards them, is misplaced. They're like other victims of empire that surround us and that we live around in our day-to-day lives. So the genocide of Native Americans is not done. It's ongoing, right? The criminalization of blackness is not done, but it's ongoing. 1 in every 3 young black men is incarcerated, not because he committed a crime, but because his behavior has been criminalized.
That's right.
And because he is policed excessively in relation to his counterparts. So there's a lot of parallels that you can build, especially with those who have that vision or some sort of political analysis. If they start from scratch, then maybe you need to show people a movie. I mean, because otherwise there's nowhere to really start having that discussion.
Good evening. My name is Asantwa Nkrumah Toure, and Sherry, Reverend Hector says, hey. And Noura, how you doing? The gentleman here touched on part of my question. I don't think we could underestimate the power of the BDS movement, and I want to give an example. Reverend Hagler at my church, Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, came up with the idea to have a conference in solidarity with Palestine. But what's going to make our conference unique from others is we're going to focus on the faith community, especially Christians, and especially African people who are Christian, because the Zionists are stepping up their recruitment of black churches and pork chop eating preachers, if you will, to get them to further support Zionism and what Zionism is doing, etc. They are specifically targeting historically black universities and colleges. A friend of mine was just asked to help mentor some students at Howard University to have a Palestine solidarity group at the campus of Howard University. But if you look at what happened to Reverend Jeremiah Wright and some other people, Jeremiah Wright was attacked not because of a sermon he gave in 2000 whatever. It's because members of his church have either been to Palestine or he preached about Gaza specifically. I know this for a fact. So I don't have any flyers because we passed out all our flyers this past weekend, but the conference will be later in the fall, and we hope for it to be in September to coincide with the article Malcolm X wrote called Zionist Logic, dated September 17, 1964, when he was in Egypt at the invitation of Nasser. So I really think we ought to really pay attention to BDS and what it means and how the different forms it can take, because it can be very, very powerful, particularly for people of African descent in this country who are Christian. Lastly, we're going to also invite our Jewish anti-Zionist brothers and sisters to also speak at this conference, because for black people who are Christian, the book of Exodus is very important to us, but we need to unpack that and show black preachers that Zionism in the Bible does not mean take somebody else's land. It has no basis theologically or politically. Thank you.
I was looking at this. We've never had the advantage that we have right now, which is that you have leading black civil rights and black power activists and militants siding with Palestine. We might as well use that, in particular at historically black colleges and universities like Howard. And I'm just even looking at this poster of what's happening in a couple of nights on Saturday night. My People Are Rising, Aaron Dixon, who's one of the co-founders of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party, he's actually coming to New York next weekend and speaking with Adala New York, which is the BDS movement, citywide movement in New York, along with somebody who is a Native American militant fighting with I Don't Know More out of Canada, and bringing together, blacks, African Americans, Native Americans, and Palestinian struggles of victims of sociocide coming together to challenge, apartheid Israel. And I think that getting people like Aaron Dixon or others here in the D.C. area, I venture to suspect that there's a few old Panthers out there, and perhaps even a few who have been to Palestine, because there have been in the last couple of years tours that, like people like Aaron have gone on, of African Americans going, along with Alice Walker, Angela Davis, to go to visit Palestine. I don't care. Call it a Panther in Palestine, put it up on Howard's campus, and I dare you to tell me that a bunch of students aren't going to want to hear what a Panther, people who they look up to, and model and put up on their dorm room walls, have to say about a contemporary struggle and its application to their lives today. Use these voices, like Angela Davis, Aaron Dixon, Alice Walker, and all these, and Reverend Hagler for that matter. Use these African-American voices to turn around the minds of many of the black students on these campuses, because the Zionists have a budget of millions to go after people as full-time jobs. What we have is the numbers, and we have the facts, and we have the history, and frankly, we have the basic element of solidarity of oppressed people across the world standing together. And that's what we're going to have to use. That's always been our side's power, solidarity.
Hi, my name is Sohail Shar, and I have a question, but before the question I need to give a little bit background information of what I want to say.
Quickly.
As quickly as possible. Okay, so I moved to the States in 2004, and before that I was living in the Middle East, so I was always thinking, why Americans are not sympathizing enough with the Palestinians. Like, if they know what's happening, if they know the stories, they should be more sympathetic. So I was thinking, okay, perhaps the perhaps it's the political issue. Then I moved here and I start talking to people. I start, interacting with Americans. And apparently, especially with white Protestant Christians, there's a problem. The problem is, according to their belief, in order to have Jesus back and have the rapture, Palestinians should not exist, and the Jews have to take over the whole thing. Otherwise, Jesus will not come back, and they will not be raptured. So now the question is, how can we confront such belief? Like, if we want people to support Palestinians and be more sympathetic towards Palestinians, how can we confront faith in this matter?
So this is my take on this, is that you're going to find many cross-sections of the American public with different interests who come into this for a particular reason. There's those who have perverse reasons, like wanting to see Jews be incinerated in a rapture. I mean, and it's quite perverse, right? But they've shaken hands with many of so the Israel lobby has entered in, this is the Christian lobby, the Christian Zionists. They've shaken hands with this alliance because of what they think to be politically expedient. And I think that if that is your target, then there's ways to target that audience that will be distinct from what this young man will do at Howard University. And I think that for all of us in the activism that we do, we need to be strategic. Speaking truth is powerful. And that truth drives us, and that truth makes us see light. But truth is not enough in order to be able to compel these audiences who speak a very particular language. And so I think that we have to think about what it is that we want to do strategically. The power of BDS is tremendous because it's a universalizing language of human rights norms and international law and things that very few people can disagree about. And what it does is it reverses the relationship between terrorist and virtuous state to colonial settler and landless person. And it creates the onus of defensiveness. It puts that onus on our Zionist counterparts, right? That's super, super, super basic. Where you go next and who you speak to depends. It will be contingent, right, on what you do. So if you are part of a university and your strategy is just to create controversy, then what you want to do is something loud as possible, like we did at Berkeley, where we occupied buildings. We had an anarchist credo. And so we never organized ourselves. We never established ourselves as a student group. We never applied for permission to use classrooms. We never asked to meet the Board of Trustees. We didn't put divestment to a resolution in the Senate. But because that was our strategy, we wanted to create controversy, and that was a good purpose because it was the beginning. Stanford 2 days ago lost its divestment board before the Board of Trustees. Did any of you even know that Stanford, how many of you knew that Stanford, okay, but it wasn't public, and but that's actually not a lot. They weren't loud about that because that was their strategic tactic. You have to start from what you want to accomplish. If it's to get your university to divest and you want to meet your Board of Trustees, you have a different strategy than those who want to create noise and create a mass movement. If you want to meet faith-based communities who believe in God, you want to have a different position than beginning from the point that God does not exist and God is, justice, right? And all I'm saying is, you all need to be strategic about how you do this. And know that at the end of the day, BDS is not the panacea. BDS is not going to set Palestinians free. Political movements, mass movements, will set Palestinians free. BDS is your responsibility and obligation as third parties in this conflict.
Hi, that last statement is actually a perfect segue into my question. So we are, playing a supporting role to Palestinians' own struggle for their liberation. But you mentioned earlier the fragmentation of the Palestinian polity, and I'm wondering by what means can refugees in particular be reintegrated into a global polity that works for its own national liberation? Is there any prospect for that happening, and if so, by what mechanisms?
So that's a really interesting question. For those of you who are interested, refugees have been at the heart of Palestinian national identity since 1948. However, as a result of this, and then the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, established itself in 1964, and Sherry alluded to this in her talk, the tensions between Palestinians and imperialists weren't just east-west, but within the Arab world itself, there were those who sought to extinguish Palestinians and to co-opt the movement as their own for certain claims to the land. So the PLO establishes itself at a historical moment so that Palestinians can be the only speakers on this issue and not have it be co-opted by other Arabs. And it's led by refugees in exile, right? Fast forward to 1988 at the PLO summit in Algiers, and there's several fragments beforehand, but there's another fragment where the PLO declares that the Palestinian state has been established and acknowledges a two-state solution. 1993, the Oslo Accords are signed, or the Declaration of Principles are signed, which were never a peace process, but were an agreement to agree. And they're signed on the White House lawn. Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, here in front of the White House lawn. And at that moment, the PLO, which had hitherto been in exile between Jordan and Beirut, and at that point Tunis, moves back to the occupied territories, into Gaza and to the West Bank in particular. In that process of moving back, they shift from a liberation politics to a state-building one. And in a state-building politics, the goal is to control capital, to control borders, and to create state institutions, as opposed to a liberation politics, which has a different vision of what return should look like and what ultimately how people should organize themselves as a self-determined polity. But that shift to a state-building project excludes the 6.6 million refugees who just do not fit, who just don't fit. And between 1993 and 2013, in the series of ongoing negotiations, from the Taba talks to Camp David II to the Wye River Accords and to Annapolis, which was the most recent, right? The discussion about refugees shifts, and it becomes no longer about the right to return for refugees. The question is, how many and to where? And this is, I can give you the details, but the closest that the negotiating parties ever got to was about 15,000 Palestinians returning to what is today Israel, and then all those who are 1948 refugees who will die within this generation, right? And everybody else can go back to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that's it. Now, where we're at, and Austin raises a really critical issue, they've been excluded by that state-building process, all international funding, all international institutions, everybody who clapped and voted for a Palestinian state, and the UN General Assembly most recently, are invested in this vision and are invested in this exclusion. So all the cards are stacked against Palestinian refugees. How they are reintegrated is really the responsibility of Palestinians, and they've demonstrated that. They've demonstrated that in organizing themselves against Mahmoud Abbas when he rescinded the Goldstone Report in 2009. They've demonstrated that in their march on the borders of historic Palestine when 13 civilians were killed, Lebanese and Syrian. And they're demonstrating that again as they discuss the reconstitution of a Palestinian National Council, which is the body that then oversees the PLO. It's a long, long road. But Sherry raised a really good point. We've been doing it for 65 years. So the time is not the issue. And that memory will not be lost. And so, but highlighting refugees is a fabulous way to resist this exclusion, even amongst Palestinians who agree that they should exclude them as a matter of compromise and pragmatism.
My name is Damian Smith, and I've got a question. And this is actually a question that has been spinning around in my head for the better part of 15 years. Ever since I started doing any activism as it relates to Israel-Palestine, and I've been confronted by Zionists, this argument that I've continued to hear come from Zionists, and I've always thought it ridiculous, is that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And I'm not suggesting that there's any merit to it. I'm just wondering where it comes from. It doesn't ring true at all, and I just don't understand where it comes from. And just one more thing. It's about a friend of Santwa. At some point, I want to talk to you about the Book of Joshua.
All right, Bible study session. I mean, in essence, it's racist because one of the things I really liked about the University of Pennsylvania's sort of BDS conference that they had last year, it opened up with a film clip that I've never seen in my life. You remember that? It was from the late 19th century. You remember how they opened it up? They opened it up with film clippings of Palestine, with Palestinians from 1890 something or other. I'd never seen this footage, and they were like, here's the non-existent people within their non-existent land, and their non-existent urban setting at their non-existent bazaar, selling fruits and vegetables. I mean, really, when I say it's racist, we're talking about from the standpoint of a sort of colonial standpoint that erases agricultural societies that don't have distinct borders in the way that quote-unquote advanced industrial capitalist nations have them. That might be said, and it's true. Through much of its, has been occupied. The Ottomans, the British, the Americans. I mean, they haven't had much autonomy. That's fair to say. But to say that it's a non-existent people who haven't been there is just simply means. Is to give expression to this sort of racialized notion that brown people living in what doesn't look anything at all like London or New York is not really a civilization or a society, which makes you think back to the old question asked of Gandhi many, many decades ago. What do you think of Western civilization? It's like, that would be a very good idea. It's about a sort of racialized colonialist posture denying an entire people because it doesn't look like, Paris and France, which, by the way, I mean, every line and every border that on the map in the world has been drawn in class society. It's not like there's anything sort of fixed about any of the borders of the Middle East. I mean, really, what is the Middle East? What is it the Middle East of? It's only the Middle East from the vantage point of London. Even calling it the Middle East is a colonialist legacy that we all cater to because we have to have some way of talking to each other in a common language. But really, every aspect of that region and every aspect of the world is an expression of class societies that have fairly arbitrarily, according to power and money, politics have drawn lines on maps. And where lines have been drawn, they can also be undrawn.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead.
So you can call it Western Asia if you want, because it is. But just to add to that, so the idea is that Palestinians are Arabs and nomadic Arabs who come primarily from the Hijaz of Saudi Arabia. And so just as they came there as part of their pastoral heritage, they can move on to other surrounding Arab countries and integrate there as well. The problem with that is a bit of a contradiction because, as Sherry points out, these are populations who didn't necessarily identify as Palestinians, but they did identify as being from Haifa, and they did identify as being from Nablus, and they did identify as being from Lid, and they did identify as being from Akka and Safad and Jalil and Naqab, and so on and so forth. So they are a landed people very rooted in that geographical way. To not identify as Palestinian at a particular moment is not unique. In the early 20th century, only 43 states existed. The nation-state concept is a relatively new one. Today, 193 states exist. And that rocket, right, that exponential growth of states is the result of decolonization, right? When these colonized nations shake the yoke of their colonial powers and they all become independent. And that's why we go from 43 to 193. And so most nationalisms and nation states are responsive to colonial movements. And in that way, all Arabs, most Arabs in colonial nations, responded in their national identity. Nationalism is a movement of resistance. It's also chauvinist and exclusionary. However, it's a movement of resistance to that colonialism. And so, if Palestinians never existed, neither did anybody else.
Americans, forget about it.
I want to open up questions to the back here, if we have any. I know you have a question.
Hi, I'm Shelly Cohen-Fudge with Jewish Voice for Peace here in DC, and I wanted to mention that we have BDS taking place here in DC already. And so we welcome everybody to get involved. AU has a new campaign against SodaStream, and our Jewish Voice for Peace DC chapter also has one. We're working together on this. We have we are doing them once a month, and we have the next one this Sunday at Columbia Heights Mall. So we hope that you'll come out and join us whenever you can. It's on the second Sunday of every month, and I'm going to have flyers out here. And also just note, if you haven't already, that there's a huge ad campaign going on in the metro system right now. That organization has started. So please spread the word. And there's two things to do for this. If you can't show up, we certainly hope you can. But you can also just get online. There's a petition now against SodaStream at sodastreamboycott.org, and it is an interfaith effort. I'm actually part of a national group because we are taking an interfaith kind of approach to it, recognizing some of the things that some of the folks have mentioned among the faith community. But by the way, Jewish Voice for Peace, many of us are secular as well, as I'm one of those. And the other thing is on this ad campaign, it's an anti-APAC campaign. Yeah. And I've got some cards about this too, and if you go to no2apac.org, please sign up for that too. Thanks.
Okay, and we have one final question, only because I promised it.
I didn't get a promise.
Great. Well, this is probably a good final question. I wanted to know if you could address, the hope for this conflict. I know I've been a Palestine solidarity activist for more than 20 years, actually before I was a socialist. And at times, it's been kind of depressing. It's been, when you look at it, you're like, I know what justice looks like, but I don't know how we could achieve it. But if you've ever listened to Omar Barghouti speak, and if people know he's kind of the spokesperson for the BDS movement, it's incredibly inspiring because he talks about the BDS movement actually making a difference, actually making Israel sit up and take notice, and that there's real hope he sees for an end to this conflict. And I think also the transformation in the Middle East that we've seen over the past couple of years, as I think the Arab Spring, I see as being, transforming the Middle East, including Palestine. So maybe both of you, I'd really like to hear, what do you see? How do you see this going forward and real hope for liberation of Palestine?
That's a big-ass question.
I think it's the best prospect there is right now in terms of making a concrete difference. And by that, I don't think it's about causing great financial damage to Israel. I mean, let's be frank with each other. We can lie to them, but amongst ourselves, we don't lie. The $4.5 billion that Veolia, which, transit and water systems and municipal systems in the illegally occupied West Bank, and therefore as part of the boycott, they've lost $4.5 billion in contracts just in Sweden alone over the last couple of years, and one can add that up. That could be replaced with, some marginal, ticking of the Pentagon, but whatever. I mean, it's not financially that we are primarily doing damage via BDS, only now we are, heading into our 8th year since the call of BDS, which was launched in June of 2005 by 170 different civil society organizations out of Palestine. What I think has been the most tremendous advance of the movement is ideologically. Yeah. That Israel does a brilliant job, in my opinion, of creating of itself a pariah state. Our job as activists is to put a megaphone in front of what they are doing and actually help bring people, towards understanding that there's something you can do about this pariah state that acts so awfully. And really, as somebody who has not only been a Palestine solidarity activist for some decades, but has been, through my own curious experience, a New York Times reader since the age of 14, it is absolutely shocking what's happened in the last year. To go from the day before Thanksgiving, a year and something ago, where Sarah Schulman's, the Jewish novelist, lesbian activist, who's very often affiliated or with ACT UP and its early incarnation, has become an active BDS campaigner. She gets a piece in the op-ed pages against Israel's attempt to use its marginal gay rights for Jews to pinkwash what they're doing with the occupation. That winds up in the New York Times and has opened up a spigot of articles, an expression of BDS and the identification of, even just the term Israeli Apartheid and occupation and illegal occupation now regularly appears. I'm not saying without criticism, but in the pages of the New York Times, the Daily News, the Los Angeles Times, the San Jose Mercury. I mean, this is a breakthrough into the mainstream. And then you even look at groups like what you have here tonight. I mean, it used to be tiny groupuscules of people on the far left that would be having conversations amongst themselves, and that would be thrilled if we can get 10 or 15 people in the room. I just came from Texas. I'm sure Noura has been on an aggressive travel schedule. I mean, all of us are traveling around the country because these groups are popping up everywhere. This is unprecedented. It is a turning point moment. We are far from where we need to be. We have an enormous distance to go. But there is a turning point happening in consciousness, and it's now becoming embedded in the civil rights lexicon of this country and understood as one of many civil rights struggles that you must begin to take a stand on. And that is an enormous leap forward from anything we have seen, and that gives me great hope. And it doesn't mean that the conditions on the ground for Palestinians are going to change tomorrow. And I don't believe that the Palestinian brothers and sisters think that it will, although they desperately need it to. But the fact that there is now an international global struggle going on that is unremitting and that is growing is something we have not seen, frankly, in my lifetime.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I just want to add, I'm a perennial optimist. Even as devastating as these facts and figures are, as devastating as it is, for example, to be in the Jordan, I was there very recently. I'm taking a delegation in late May with the Interfaith Peace Builders Group. But to be in different parts of the West Bank and to witness forced displacement in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah around Jerusalem, and for no one to know about that in Ramallah, and then to go to the Jordan Valley and to see people displaced and their water removed and have to buy water back from Israeli occupation forces, and no one to know about that in Jericho. We're talking about less than miles away between these vicinities. And so there is an intense fragmentation process happening internally that's also fragmenting Palestinian national interests. And that's the greatest threat, actually, is that Palestinians can't identify what is in their national interest as opposed to what's happening globally. Because if those in Gaza want the siege to be lifted, but that's not connected to a Palestinian from Haifa and Burj al-Barajneh to return, and that has nothing to do with the displacement of a Jerusalemite in Sheikh Jarrah whose residency has been revoked, we have a major problem. Because then what does solidarity do if Palestinians can't make those demands? But even that fragmentation is externally stimulated, and it's part of a process of divide and conquer. So yes, part of the struggle and part of the hope is to elevate a level of consciousness and to make this part of discourse. And I would say that the reason it's become such a mainstream part of discourse in the U.S. is finally we've begun to separate what's in the U.S.'s interest, as empire even, and what's in Israel's interest. And those are not the same thing. Those are still problematic, but they're not the same thing. And finally, that distance has allowed us to be able to speak so that you notice a palpable shift in discourse from the pummeling of Gaza in 2008 and 9 and the pummeling of Gaza in 2011. As people start to ask, wait, you're about to do this every 4 years?
Right.
So there is that shift in discourse, and I think that it's palpable. And my favorite people are Palestinian solidarity activists, because gosh, once you're hooked, you don't leave. And you don't need to be here, and I just applaud you and that effort and all the constant, incessant, brave work that you do. Thank you.